Hello, everybody. So this is Curl. It's nice to be here, and I appreciate you spending a Friday morning to talk about arts and advocacy. I do hear a brief pause in the leaf blower that was right outside my window. So if you do hear a buzzing, I'm okay. There's no drones, it's just leaves blowing. I mentioned to David and Teresa before that also my kids are home from school, but they have promised to, because they don't have school at CPS, but they promised to stay off the Xbox and other online games. So my internet connection should be fairly good. And so we're looking forward to a good conversation today. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, this will work. And we'll have some PowerPoints up while I speak. Let's give it a try. Can everybody see this lovely shade of blue? Actually, two shades of blue.
Looks good, Jonathan. We forgot to send you the memo that it's required that you have it in maroon or gold for Loyola, but
Oh,
blue
okay. All right. All right.
blue blue will be just fine.
I'll get a rambler in somehow, right? That's a wolf, right? Or not? It,
Good
it.
job. Well done.
See, I studied. I studied. Um, it's good to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to come. Today, as the name talks about, we're going to talk about art and advocacy and art, and most of all, we'll have some stuff specifically if you're interested in supporting the arts in what you can do. I just want to say, first of all, a little bit about who I am. This picture is evidence that before COVID, I did wear a tie. I don't know though. Maybe it's been a couple years since I wore one since before COVID, but there's proof here. But my name is Jonathan. I'm Jonathan VanderBrug, and I serve as the Deputy Director of Civic Engagement for Arts Alliance Illinois. Arts Alliance is a nonprofit organization or a statewide organization that champions the arts, arts education, and culture. We're actually the largest entity in Illinois that just focuses on arts and advocating both for the performing arts and for arts learning. So we stretch all the way from members down in Carbondale all the way up to Waukegan and Rockford. We're a very diverse group. I am not necessarily consider myself a lifelong artist, but I've always been surrounded by the arts. My wife teaches the arts at North Park University. My brother is an arts teacher, and my grandfather, who I was extremely close to, my son is named after him, started one of the first arts programs in rural Iowa. And when that was something very new there, that you would study painting in addition to other things. And I spent a lot of time with him growing up, and that meant a lot of time painting and drawing, and the kindness that I and love that I felt from him and care, I always see through the lens of art because that's how he expressed it. And so art has affected me that way. We'll get into this a little bit later in terms of you'll see my view come through about the intertwining of all issues. And I am very interested in I'm a liberal arts product. My career has stemmed from starting an inner city gardening program for at-risk youth called Urban Produce in Grand Rapids. I worked for the Michigan House of Representatives doing tax policy and writing tax legislation for the Michigan House. I also spent some time in St. Louis as the executive director of the St. Louis Lead Poisoning Prevention Coalition. I've done some work on healthcare reform, and then a very meaningful experience when I first got here to Chicago was doing environmental justice organizing on the south side, so neighborhoods like Beaubien Woods and Elgel Gardens, in terms of the effects of pollution on those areas. So it's been a winding road for me, but one of the themes that has always been there has been the arts as part of the people around me and as the creativity that I've seen in each one of these issues, in every single one of these issues, even in tax. There were artists that were involved, that were creative, that were bringing innovation to the call for social justice in each of these areas. So when the opportunity came to work for the Alliance and actually work directly for the arts, I jumped on it and I've enjoyed it ever since. And I want to share today some of my reflections on what has happened to the arts sector in a way as kind of a mirror of what's happened to our larger sector when it comes to advocacy, policy, and dealing with COVID. So, hello. A couple things today. Please feel free to doodle. Now, when I was growing up, if you were caught doodling, that was a problem because it was seen as a distraction, it was seen as frivolous. What we know now, actually through research, is doodling usually helps you listen. It's a good thing to do while you're trying to take in information. So you know what? If I see you, unless you're drawing weird caricatures of me, I might object to that. But otherwise, if you have a pad of paper and want to draw, go for it. Or if you want to mold something in your hands, go for it. As Teresa said, oh, and you won't be expected to show your doodles. So this is a non-judgmental doodling time. You're always welcome to chime in. David and Teresa are going to kind of pick up if I miss anything on chat, or just, I can't necessarily see everybody, but say, hey, you, and we'll get you. So my hope is that this can be a little bit interactive and that I can learn from you in addition to anything that I might share. Use the chat. I will put the chat out now so that I can see it, but feel free to share stuff with each other over chat and to add to the things that I'm saying. Feel free to eat. Like, we're getting up to lunch. There's no, like, if you're hungry, grab the candy from Halloween or whatever. There's no judgment here. And if you have to stand, my word, go ahead and do it. It might be the only way I see how tall you are because everyone looks the same height over Zoom. So if you have to stand or walk around, that's no problem. And in all of this, I hope that we get to wonder a little bit together about what are the arts, what does advocacy mean, and what's happened during this time of COVID. So first, I'd like to just get a sense of you, or to help to kind of prime the pump of thinking. And feel free to, I encourage you to put this in chat. There are no right or wrong answers to these. But my first question I'm curious to know is, what is your connection to the arts? And notice I don't say, do you have a connection to the arts? What is your connection to the arts? What role does it play in your life? Could be listening to the radio, to music. You might like to doodle on your own time. You may have a child or a friend who plays the guitar and you listen. So that's the first thing that I'm going to ask. Yell it out or put it in chat. Are the arts in your life? And if so, how? Oh, all right. Someone's living it there. Listen to music, yep. Oh, art-based reflection in my teaching. That's really interesting. Sing, yes. Nice, I love this. Quilt, what a skill. We have art history majors are everywhere. Every time I do something, they're all around. They bring a ton of great skills. I mentioned in the chat that my son started playing banjo when he was 7. I don't know anyone who plays the banjo. We didn't know anyone who plays the banjo. He saw, I think, that Kermit the Frog plays the banjo, and I think that did it. And he stuck with it. And for me, it's just been a really joy. I like to joke that I know more about rye whiskey and coon hunting because of the history of the instrument and the songs and the folk music. But man, what a joy that's to hear him play the banjo. Art Appreciation, Steve Martin banjo. Yeah. So when you think about these things, and obviously the title was arts, and you're here. So unless you're on the wrong Zoom, you care about the arts. So my next question is, what makes these things important in your life, or what value do the arts have for you? And that could be something as simple as joy. Oh yeah, the community aspect. Yeah, yeah, to grow as humans. Yeah, inspiring. Yeah, yeah. The arts is inspiring. The For me, especially during the pandemic, the whole sometimes it's felt for me like either drawing or listening to music was some way, even when I wasn't actually outside, it felt like getting outside of myself a little bit. There was a kind of a wonder and exploration part of that. Yeah, the whole history of protest in the arts. So one of the things and keep them coming as you think about it and things pop up. Um, when I refer to the arts, it's kind of helpful to for me to say kind of what I'm referring to or what I'm talking about. When I refer to arts, I refer actually to a broad range of things. Sometimes you'll hear arts advocates refer to the creative sector, and there's many different ways to think about the arts sector or the arts community. Today, the way I'm going to use that is the five artistic disciplines. We especially think of them this way in arts education. So you have dance, music, drama or theater. Um, then we have, let's see, dance, music, drama, theater, media arts is the fifth one. We think of some as performing arts, so like dance and theater, some as presenting arts or producing arts, visual arts, media arts. I'm also going to include in that definition, though, as well, cultural enterprises. We might think of, for example, in Chicago, house museums. At the Alliance, museums and cultural institutions are a big part of our membership. Local cultural centers, whether it's dealing with American Indian heritage or Black heritage, that whole community that keeps alive history and heritage is also considered part of the arts. So culture as well, I include in that. And then also, it's sometimes easy to think of arts as just an arts nonprofit, like a museum or an art gallery, or an individual artist. But we also are beginning more and more to think about the creative sector as also including the for-profit sector. It very much includes the for-profit sector. Creative industries, whether it's the music industry, whether it's design. I was talking with someone from the Illinois Manufacturing Association last week, and they were explaining to me how important design is, the whole creativity of design is to the manufacturing process. And so I'll use the word arts, but in that, I encourage you to think very broadly about what the arts sector is. It's a very diverse sector. That's the arts part. But what about the advocacy part? When you think of the word advocacy, because it is thrown out a lot, it's used a lot, what do you think of when you think of the word advocacy? What does it mean to you? And it can have many different meanings. Another way to phrase that is, have you advocated before? I think in an earlier conversation, I heard that someone has a little kid in the house. Toothbrush time is usually a time of advocacy, or eating vegetables is usually a time of advocacy, right? Trying to move someone's actions. Working towards policy change. Yeah, group advocacy and education together. Yeah, there's a part of awareness to that policy change. Uh, it's fun to look at the root and keep the ideas coming too. I like to think of what is the root of the word, and the word advocacy comes from the Latin, and the Latin is advocare. Ad meaning to, and vocare meaning vocal or voice. Or you talk about your vocation or your calling. Advocacy comes from the same root word. It's voicing or calling for change. And advocacy can be personal advocacy, such as getting your child to brush his teeth or helping them get ready for school on time. But that's kind of personal advocacy, or getting a doctor's bill lowered or a discount negotiated. Today, what I'm going to focus on when I say advocacy is kind of more towards what Teresa just put in chat, and that is policy change, as opposed to change that where I'm working as an individual to change my situation. I'm going to use the word advocacy, that calling for systemic change, for system-wide change, particularly advocacy for policy change. How do we change the way our public institutions, especially government, works? How do we work through laws and rules and regulations in the legislative process? So that's what we'll go for. So what we're going to cover today is this presentation was actually really helpful for me individually, and I was really glad that David and Teresa asked me to speak. It was a gift for them to give me this opportunity, because it provided me, not that I needed one, but it provided me an excuse to try to pause after a year and a half of surviving and racing COVID, and try to pause and think, what happened? what It's been such a race for survival for the arts sector. It has been a tough couple of years. Like, it's almost a couple of years now, right? Year and a half. It's been an existential crisis for the arts sector, and we'll get a little bit into that. But I want to do three things today with you. Is to first, just to share a little bit about the arts sector's journey. And I really should say journeys, because when I say the arts sector, it's a little bold of me to claim I can speak for the arts sector. I don't. It has many different voices. And when I talk today, I'm not talking on behalf really of the sector. I'm not talking on behalf of Arts Alliance Illinois either. It's just my view as an individual that has kind of seen this happen, seen it, the impact on friends who are artists, on organizational partners who are artists. So the first thing we're going to do is just walk through what's happened, knowing that's an ongoing story. What's been the impact of COVID? What has the response been? What's the situation now, and what might happen in the future? And through that, secondly, I started out saying, and I hinted at this a little bit in the description, let's identify some lessons about the art of advocacy that we can learn. Now that we can look back a little bit at the COVID crisis and the fight for resources to survive, what can we learn about what works and what doesn't work in advocacy? What I realized is when I went through this exercise is I had way more questions than I did actual lessons. So my intention was to come and say, remember to do this, I've learned this. What I found myself doing is I thought about these different advocacy situations we've been in, and it just raised more questions for me about what do we do as a sector. Research will play a big part of that in helping us answer that. So what I'm actually going to do today is, as I share the story of what's happened so far with the arts sector, is I'm actually going to ask a bunch of questions. And I'm interested in which ones you think resonate, because I think the questions that I'll ask apply to the arts sector, but go beyond that too. And I'm going to use a frame called, has anyone heard? I know we have some teachers. I'm not a professional teacher, but has anyone heard of the concept of EUs and EQs, enduring understandings and essential questions? Arts Alliance Illinois coordinated. I was involved in coordinating the 18-month process of updating Illinois' arts learning standards. A couple years ago was the first update in about 20 years. And learning standards, as you know, probably in academia, are what you expect students to be able to do and to know at various levels of their growth as students. And in the learning standards for Illinois, as in many other standards, they're organized by these things called EUs and EQs. And enduring understandings are basically the big ideas that hold the learning standards together. They're the big fundamental concepts. And then EQs are basically the questions that are intended to provoke more thought. They're also especially intended, EQs are to help you think across disciplines. EQs are the things that when you ask a question in the learning standards, it crosses over art and theater, and you ask it also, it helps bridge differences. So we'll be going through some what I think are some EUs and some EQs. And the EQs, do I have the answer? No. And then finally, some opportunities to advocate. That's the organizer fun stuff. That's the rile stuff up. So just to quickly set the context, someone mentioned arts and protest. There is a long history, and I'd love to go into it. It's vast. It's an amazing. You can teach whole courses and have whole degrees on it. The long and strong history of arts and social change, of artists leading social change, of artists calling for justice, for artists calling for compassion, whether it's the civil rights movement or the abolition movement or other issues, environmental justice today. Artists have really been at the forefront of calling for change. And artists are particularly powerful advocates. Artists are used to taking risks. Artists are used to working within limitations, and even within limitations, creating, and I think someone mentioned earlier, inspiring. And so the relationship between advocacy and the arts, systemic or system change and the arts, is long and strong. And I think one of the things that we in the arts sector are seeking to do more is the concept of arts and. In other words, saying it's not just, art in and of itself has value and is important. However, artists are also intricately involved in other issues affecting society. Arts and the military, some of the most innovative work the National Endowment for the Arts is doing is in partnership with the Department of Defense in terms of creative therapies. How, when they have veterans that are coming back from combat, how can the arts, how can theater help them process what they went through and deal with some of the trauma that's there? We talk about arts and COVID right now. Arts Alliance Illinois has a program where we're commissioning or sponsoring artists across the state who are using their creative practice to help raise awareness about vaccines and the need to get vaccinated. Artists are usually very connected to their local community. They're usually very trusted in their local community. And so oftentimes artists can connect with people that traditional means of outreach can't connect to. And so that whole concept of arts and, I think, is something that is gaining the prominence more than it needs. So let's first of all start that journey where I can tell you and we can talk about, review what's happened to the arts sector. This is kind of the equivalent of, well, I feel like during COVID, one question that has regained a little bit of its meaning is, how are you? Not always, but at least particularly when COVID was starting, the question of how are you doing or how have you been seemed to have a little bit more meaning. And when we talk about what's happened, the journey, it's kind of asking the sector, how have you been? What's happened? And the first thing to emphasize is it has been tough. It has been frightening for a lot of artists as they've seen their business dry up. The arts, as you know, are based on people getting together. They're based on concerts. And so the arts sector, the creative sector, has, without a doubt, been hit the hardest of any industry, even more than restaurants and hospitality, because there is no takeout when it comes to theater for the most part. The arts were the industries were the first to close, and they'll likely be the last to reopen. Even if you put things online as a theater or an opera performance, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a sustainable business practice. So it's been a real struggle for the arts sector. I was talking to a member of a orchestral quartet, and right when the restrictions started coming down, I believe it was in March or so, the first March of COVID, these four musicians were playing at a school, at a high school, a concert that they were giving for high school students to raise awareness of music and orchestral music. They, of course, had their phones off for the 30 minutes that they played. When they got done, they got to the back of the gym and were putting their instruments away, and they each were checking their phone. All four of them in the course of that half hour received messages about canceled events. In that 30 minutes, they had seen their gigs boom, 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 boom dry up and were without work. So we see the Illinois creative industries, based on a Brookings report, $5.3 billion in cumulative losses. Think about this, 63% of Illinois' creative organizations laid off or furloughed staff. 2/3. And when you look at unemployment insurance claims, they were significantly higher. They grew almost tripled, more than tripled in the creative industries. And that was twice the rate seen in other industries, including the restaurant industry. There's a double whammy too, because there are some gig workers in the arts who also work in the restaurant and entertainment industry. So not only did they lose their gigs, many of them also lost their part-time employment that was supporting that. And it's something that really ripples out, because we often don't think of the arts and the economy, but the arts, the creative sector, is a huge economic engine in Illinois and across the nation. If you look at Illinois' economy and what the arts contribute, it's about $30 billion or so. So it's a job creator, it's an economic generator, and when businesses had to close, it it hurt, and it's been devastating. The one thing that I want to note, and this is kind of the first enduring understanding, is the connection between, and this is Curl, right? It has research in it, that our advocacy has been absolutely dependent on research. In order for us to know what is happening in the arts sector, we've needed to have that data of unemployment. We've needed to have the processing and analysis of data about how people are being effective. You can look at those numbers there, and you know what? They're not recent. July 2020. I'll be upfront. January 2020 to 21. We need more recent numbers. It's been difficult because we have a sector that's been over-surveyed. The moment COVID hit, 1 million surveys went out. How is this affecting you? Many people have dropped out of the sector, but the arts sector needs a more robust research infrastructure. We have amazing researchers. I think of Jennifer Novak Leonard with U of I, Data Arts, which is also a great researcher. Ingenuity in Illinois is a national leader in arts and data, but the arts and data are not separate. They're fused together when it comes in advocacy. And so the question that I begin to think with other advocates is, how can we in the arts sector build a more robust research infrastructure? There's a million different projects that we desperately need, not just for the sake of it, but for advocacy, so that we can tell legislators, this is the impact we're seeing, this is how people are being affected. but we don't have that infrastructure right now. And that's a question that we as the sector, well, we have it, but it could be so much more. And that's something that we as a sector have to work through. I imagine some of you probably are researchers. And so if you want to research the arts, I have a very long list here of projects that you can do if you're interested. It's something we need. The second thing that I've seen is COVID, and this might be no surprise, has basically exacerbated the inequities that existed before. So I mentioned the severe impact that COVID has had on the arts sector. That impact has not been borne equally across our society or across the arts sector. If you're Black, Latinx, chances are you've been hit harder by COVID or by the economic effects of COVID than if you are white. It's been a very disproportionate impact. If you look at the numbers, I mentioned the high unemployment. In 2020, the unemployment rate among BIPOC artists was 2/3, 66%. And that's more than the rate was for white artists. Still high, 52%, but there's definitely a difference. Black-led organizations have entered the COVID crisis with far fewer resources to weather the crisis than white organizations. Bridgespan report, it was a pretty good report, found that Black-led organizations were 76% smaller than white-led organizations in terms of their net unrestricted assets. Not only were Black and Brown communities and organizations hit harder by COVID, they also came into COVID because of systemic racism, that's the reason, with fewer resources to weather the storm. And so what we've seen is we like to think of, when we get to this recovery, we like to think of a recovery as a V, right? You get hit economically, you go down, the effects are felt, but eventually the hope is you pull out. That's the right side of the V. You go down and everyone pulls out. We're not seeing that. We're seeing what economists refer to as a K recovery. And that K recovery is boom. I think I'm doing it. I'm doing it backwards. Is this right? Or is it this way? This way. Is it this way?
I think you're fine there. Now I don't even remember what a K looks like. So yes, that's perfect. There you go.
But basically what you have is it's hit everybody, and that's the vertical line of the K. But the recovery has not been the same for everybody. Some people have done better because of COVID. Some people can take the stimulus checks that they've received and use it to refinance their home to get more savings because they own a home and they have other savings that they can draw upon. But the wealthy have gotten, by most accounts, wealthier. And that tends to be white people. But there's a bottom side of the K. Some people are not recovering. They're having a harder time. Mostly BIPOC, and by that I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, for the most part, are not seeing the improvement that white communities are seeing. So we're seeing what then is a K, right? It's not everybody down, everybody out. It's actually a widening gap caused by COVID. We've had tons of rain recently, right? What I noticed during one of the last torrential rainfalls that happened here, tons of rain coming down, is our basement, some of the water started leaking, not bad, but through our basement, the bricks in our basement. Nothing has changed, but what changed was the torrential rain. And when it put the stress on our basement, then I could see the problem really bad. I walked by that wall, basement wall, 100 times, dry. Then the torrential rain hit, and then I'm like, wait a second, that wall is weak. There are gaps there. I can see it now. And oh, wait a second, my neighbor has their downspout pointed right towards my basement. They're not containing their water. I walked by their downspout 1,000,000 times. I didn't notice that it was going to bring us water until rain hit. And COVID has been a torrential rain that has shown all the leaks, all the weaknesses of our system, and that includes racism and the effects of racism. One of the things that I think it calls upon us to do, and here I speak to those who are white, is that we need to do a better job of elevating and supporting and putting in the lead, or allowing in the lead, BIPOC voices. That voices who have been impacted the most by COVID should be the ones that have the leadership and the voice in dealing with and how we respond to that. I like to think that there's a difference between prominence and significance. Everyone's experience with COVID, everyone's struggle with COVID, their story is meaningful and is equally significant. Not one person's story is more significant than another. However, not everyone's story needs to take prominence all the time. And I think now is a time, especially when we see the strains of systemic racism that is being exacerbated by COVID, now is a time when it's important to make sure that BIPOC stories, leadership, and experience have prominence. Not to the disregard of the significance of others, but have prominence. And so I think what we see here in terms of an enduring understanding is nothing that's a surprise, but it's important to consider is how much systemic racism plagues the arts sector. I'm talking about the larger sector, the larger society, but particularly we as artists in the arts sector are really having a time of reckoning right now, both as a fallout from George Floyd and similar to the Black Lives Movement, but an appropriate light is being shined on the racism and inequity that exists within the arts sector. That's an enduring understanding of something that we have to realize. And I think the question for us in the sector right now is how can we as an arts sector, as museums, as arts organizations, how can we kind of truly, not symbolically, but truly give prominence to the stories of people who are being affected the most? And that's a big question I don't have the answer to, but we better be asking it if we want to have integrity as a sector. That's the impact. And here's the response. The response, I think, has been one of a government response. When this hit, there was a response from private foundations, responses from individual donors. But let's be real, no entity had a checkbook big enough to deal with this crisis than the government, and then the federal government. This was a time actually when people, even of different political stripes, noticed that the government needed to be involved and had to be involved. And it has underscored the vital role that government has to play when it comes to situations like this. The sectors that had invested in engaging government officials, the sectors that had invested in building grassroots advocates, were best positioned, because you don't want to go to a legislator only during a time of crisis. You want to build that relationship up over time. And those sectors that have been able to do that were in a better position to get aid. But I think this has been a reminder that government and public policy are, and this is an enduring understanding, are vital movers and provide some unique supports and opportunities to advance supports, especially during times like these. And for that reason, I think we as a sector have to ask ourselves the correlation question, and that is, how do we as an art sector as a whole better position ourselves to be advocates? And that's one of the things that Arts Alliance is working on. We're doing a revamp of our Advocacy 101 training where people can come and learn how to talk to legislators and learn how to make the case for the arts. And we need to do a better job of that. If government and public policy is so influential, and it is, we also have to be concerned about the health of that system, the health of the democratic system. there are core issues that can impede or get in the way of progress in supporting the arts and supporting environment, etc. Some of those core issues are redistricting reform, campaign finance reform, these ways in which our system is not operating the way it should, the way it's called to work. The great divide that we have in terms of polarization and how redistricting and divided, the emphasis on primaries and winning your primary even more than the general causes people to lean more further left or further right. But there's these core issues that affect every sector, and that includes the arts sector. So we as an arts sector have to ask ourselves, can we and to what extent must we be involved in advocacy for fixing the core issues of our democratic system if during times of crisis we're going to depend upon that system? One example is this. In arts education, the Alliance seeks to move forward an agenda that involves increasing arts learning for kids. And we talked about the arts is one of the very few subjects in Illinois that is actually not required of students. But we talk about different policies that we want to advance to enhance arts learning in Illinois. One policy that I'm convinced that we need to be a part of is the evidence-based funding formula that was passed in Illinois in order to try to bring some funding equity to the education system. Does that involve only the arts? No, it's about fundamentally reforming the way education is funded. But if we're going to ask for funding for the arts, we also need to be part of that core question. So what are those core issues that we have to be at the table of? And then I think a corollary of all that, the question is, how do we get arts nonprofits more interested in advocacy and more engaged in advocacy? So I can't see everybody, but let's see. Now I can see everybody. So this is not really a test, but do the thumbs up or the hand signal if you believe that nonprofits can lobby. 501c3 organizations can lobby. They can. So raise your hand if you think that's the case. Yeah, I see one person, two people. Raise your hand if you think they cannot lobby. A 501c3 cannot lobby. I have a confession to make. I'm a registered lobbyist. I know David's not going to want to talk to me anymore. 501c3s can lobby. I would say they should lobby, and that's a whole nother session. But nonprofits under IRS law are allowed to advocate with unlimited scope. They can talk about why an issue is important. They can raise awareness of issues. They can talk about general things such as why we need affordable housing or why the arts should be funded. That's advocacy. Lobbying, again, I'm not going to get into kind of legal advice, but lobbying is when you start to actually seek to influence legislation, where you begin to say, I think Representative so-and-so, you should vote for House Bill 53. Nonprofits can do that. They're allowed to do that, and you know what? They should. They're limited in how much they can do it, but they can do it. And I would argue that they should. I like to, when I would teach adjunct nonprofit policy at North Park University, the phrase I would constantly say is, there is no nonprofit mission or program that I can't or someone can't advance, stop, or stymie through a policy. And we would have kind of a fun game where you name a program of a nonprofit and I'll name you 2 or 3 policies that if they pass will shut your project down. So if we want to achieve the missions and vision of our nonprofits, we need to be involved in the policy process. And that does mean lobbying. Now you can't electioneer. You can't endorse candidates. It's unlimited advocacy, limited lobbying, and totally prohibited electioneering. But that's the thing but the question is, I think, as a sector, how do we get nonprofits, for-profits, and individuals more engaged. People want to stand up? Are you doodling? You can. Any questions at this point? Are these questions ringing a bell? Are there any other questions so far that have seem more relevant than others? Educating elected officials, yes. Um, that's a way to put it too. Could we see a copy of this presentation? We'll see how it ends. If it ends well, then that might be possible.
It is being
No.
It is being recorded too.
Oh shoot! Okay. All right. I've been talking a lot. You guys still with me? Okay. Here's a game. What do you see these letters here? I also see a doodle. I was starting to doodle while I was doing the PowerPoint. So, what is that? What code is that? You want to take a guess? Take your microphone off or go on chat. This, I don't know if you can see my, oops. Let's see. ARP, ERTC, UI, PUA, PEUC, FPUC. You want to take a guess what that is? Code. Cold War era spy message. Each one of those is a public program, an acronym for a public program passed by Congress that saved a lot of people's livelihoods. Look at that. Oh my word. So here's a fun. So we have the CARES Act, which was the response from the government has been in waves. So the initial response was called the CARES Act. It was a massive multi-billion-dollar effort to respond to the crisis and to respond as quickly as possible. It was called the CARES Act. A series of waves of federal support, congressional support, then happened as do you remember when we were like, oh, this is going to last 6 months? Nah. So what happened then is that the government needed to take make future waves of support. There were two big ones, the CARES Act and then ARP, the American Rescue Plan. The CARES Act, of course, was under Trump. The ARP was under Biden. And they were multi-trillion-dollar efforts to seek to keep the economy afloat, including all sectors. There are some programs that you might have heard of. There's the Paycheck Protection Program. There were 2 rounds of it, 1 and 2. There's the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program that also came from the Small Business Administration, that was designed to provide immediate, fast loans to businesses, particularly small businesses that were struggling to survive because of COVID. There was one congressional program or one federal program that was really specific to the arts. It was called SVOG, or the Small Venue Operators Grants. There was at one point the estimate that as many as 90% of independent venues would go out of business in the United States. These are small, these are not the big venues, they're small, independently owned. Some of them are nonprofit community theaters. They live many times from concert to concert. If you completely eliminate a year's worth of concerts, how are they going to stay in business? And so they did receive a program that was aimed at them because they're getting hit particularly hard. There was relief that was given through the tax system, and the employee retention tax credit is one of them. And then there was three, actually four programs, and we'll get into this a little bit, that were given to individuals. And gig workers are a big part of the arts sector. So that UI, that unemployment insurance, there was pandemic unemployment assistance, there was pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, there was federal pandemic unemployment compensation, and the list goes on. My point in this, though, is I like to joke about acronyms, but at the same time, they are the language of help in this case. And I think that we as a sector need to realize that policy is a distinct language of power. We learn different languages, and policy is one of those languages, to learn about cause and effect in programs. And all of these programs, everything that you see here, were programs that, in one way or another, helped the arts sector. Paycheck, and some of them were controversial, some of them worked a lot better than others, but PPP loans, EIDL loans helped a lot of creative small businesses and arts nonprofits stay afloat. But it came through the Small Business Administration. It was an issue of loans. The Employee Retention Tax Credit is helping still, many nonprofits and others keep people on payroll. That comes through the IRS. Unemployment insurance is a whole nother thing that happens through the state. So if we as an arts sector are going to survive and get the help that we need, look at the things that we have to be aware of, that we have to learn how these issues are integrated. Tax, unemployment, small business loans. We need to recognize that these are all interrelated. And so how can we as a sector teach this policy language? Civic education is a big part of that. And what other sectors do we get to know, need to get to know, whether it's the business community or the tax community, that makes this important. And then I'm going to end with two examples that I think are particularly important that I'm going to wrap up with, that I think illustrates some of the policy struggles and what we need to think about. One example, I talked about equity already, was the paycheck, what I call the PPP Paradox. The Paycheck Protection Program was designed to get relief out fast, because the sense was the ships of business, small and large, were sinking. If you're going to get money out fast, and if you think about it, they got a heck of a lot of money out really fast. Some people would say too fast. But if you're going to get that amount of money out to businesses that are drowning, you have to work through existing systems. You don't have time to make a whole new system. What was the existing system that they used? They used the private banking system. In other words, if you wanted a PPP loan, you needed to go to a private bank that would help you apply to the federal government. That was fast. That was deemed the fastest way to get the money out there. Here's the problem. It's also an incredibly inequitable way to get the money out there, because there are certain communities, mostly Black and brown communities, who have not had a good relationship with private banks, who have been harmed by private banks. And so what was deemed to be the most efficient was not the most fair. And I think the question that we have to answer is, a lot of times speed can be the enemy, or can be a tool of racism. Like, we don't have time for that. We gotta go. And that's been a theme throughout systemic racism. At the same time, however, there are times like COVID when you have to move quickly. So it's that paradox of, how do we achieve what I call there the question, nimble equity, in terms of how can we move quickly in times of political crises in a way that's also equitable. And I don't have an answer to that. I think there were some strategies, two things. There were some short-term and immediate-term strategies to help. So there were special navigators that reached out to try to recruit businesses in Black and brown communities for PPP loans. There were times when they would actually halt the loan applications and only accept loans from small businesses to kind of give them space That was one. You could prioritize. So in Illinois, they had back to business grants, and they actually said, in giving these grants, we are going to prioritize businesses in disproportionately impacted areas. So that we need to think of those creative solutions. But what it comes down to, I think, is investing in the equity in our long-term infrastructure. It's another reason why we need more equity in private banking, because if we have to rely on that system to move things quickly, it needs to be more equitable. So it's a question that we need to, what core anti-racist infrastructure do we need to advocate as an arts sector to see changed so that during times of crisis, we can see some equity and speed. And then the final example that I want to give, one was of PPP, but what really hit me was how individual artists were impacted. I walked up and down the business corridor of my neighborhood, and I saw business closed signs. Our local barbershop business closed. Our local grocery store business closed. The signs that I couldn't see were all those individual freelancers and gig workers who also had a sign closed, but they were kind of invisible. We don't see them every day, but they are a massive key part of the arts sector. And they are a growing fundamental part of the US economy. And it's only going to grow, that kind of, both in the traditional marketplace and in the individual marketplace. And what we saw is that our system is not set up to help or support freelancers or gig workers in any way whatsoever. And it hit the arts sector very hard. Can a freelancer, a fully independent contractor, get unemployment insurance benefits? No. If you are an independent contractor and that's what you do, there is no unemployment system for you. When COVID hit, they actually had to create one from scratch in order to give unemployment benefits to individual independent contractors. So they rolled out a program where you could be an independent contractor and you could still apply for unemployment insurance. They provided other programs that extended coverage, and that was a lifeline to many people. It's gone, completely gone. And one thing that's a message for the arts sector is our road to recovery is very, very long. It's estimated, I think there's a Hopkins study that said the average arts nonprofit, based on job losses and certain economic factors, has about 25.5 months to go until full recovery, and that's longer than any other type of nonprofit organization. There's a lot of internal damage. We've been punched in the gut, and a lot of because of the canceling shows, etc. They might appear like they're reopening now, but they're running on fumes. And they've had costs that we're not sure recover from. I was at the Old Town School of Field Music and talking to executive director Jim, and we were in one of their theaters, and he pointed up to me at the fans and the air conditioning systems. And those are really important equipment in the music industry. If you don't use them, dust builds up. So you either use them or you pay someone to clean them. Well, what if you don't have any income, you can't pay people to clean them, and you're not using them? What happens? They get damaged, and you have to replace them. That's just one type of cost that puts businesses in debt if they're in the arts sector. And it's the same with independent contractors. Many of them have blown through their savings, pulled down their retirement accounts, and it's a long road to recovery. And what we saw in this situation was that there was not a lot of voice. Apart from maybe the Uber workers, if you would look out and reach out and say, who's talking for gig workers? Where are gig workers having a voice? Where are arts gig workers having a voice? That's where it comes down to the arts sector, where we need to do a better job of giving them a voice. And how can we do that is a key question, because those creative individuals are in many ways the heart of what we do. That's kind of the story, and that brings us up until to now. And I'll end by giving you some specific opportunities in what's happening now. But any questions or observations about what's happened so far? What a complex journey, and it's still going on.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
My name's Teresa. I'm on staff here at Curl. So what were you able to concretely do during all of this to advocate, to talk to policymakers? Like, what role did your organization and you, Jonathan, like play to try to make sure that the people making decisions were aware of what you've been talking about this whole presentation?
Yeah, and we'll get into a little bit because it's stuff that we will continue to do. But I think that's a great question. We, first of all, in terms of some wins that we were able to get, we were much more active at the federal level than we usually are, because that's where the money was coming from. We were very involved in the fight to win PPP loans and to make sure that our types of businesses were included in that. Um, SVOG was a big fight as well. We wanted to say we need a specific pool or pot of money for venues because of their needs. So we were very active. NEVA, the National Independent Venues Association, was a big part of that, and we worked with them. At the state level, I didn't get into this, I was getting into it, but a lot of the money from the federal government came down to the states, and they said, states, here's money for you to use. So we were especially active at the state level. And one of the things that we were able to do was that when the state took their federal COVID relief money, they put business interruption grants out there. And through advocacy, we were able to get the arts sector as a priority industry. So what the state said is, okay, these relief grants are going out, but we are going to prioritize, restaurants was one, but we're going to prioritize the arts sector because we know they're getting hit the most. And we were able to do that again in another round. Chicago is fortunate because it has a very concentrated group of foundations, of private foundations. We were able to start the Arts for Illinois Relief Fund. Had some public government dollars come into that, mostly private, that gave very quick pay the rent, buy groceries grants to artists. All of these things we were able to do through email campaigns where we emailed, and we have a system where you can email and call legislators automatically. We gave trainings to advocates and then helped them set up meetings with their state legislators who could bring the message right to them. Social media was a big part of that, and I can give our connections there in terms of keeping up the pressure. And then a lot of it too is once we establish those special programs is to help people connect to them. And that actually brings us to our big campaign right now. We're seeking the Illinois Creative Future Fund. The state of Illinois has received $8 billion in very flexible COVID relief money from the federal government. Illinois' financial situation right now is better than it's ever been because it's received $8 billion. They've only spent $2.5 billion of that, and they have another 2 to 3 years. We're arguing that Illinois does what the state of New York has already done and what California has already done, and that is set aside some of that money for relief and recovery of the creative sector. So we're asking for $500 million over 3 years to be dedicated to relief and recovery of the creative sector, arts education, creative workforce development, and other things like that. California has dedicated $600 million, they just passed that. And then New York has $200 million to $800 million in terms of available. So that is a campaign that's going to hit, and I can send out links to you to get involved. We encourage people to meet with their legislators, and we can help train you. If that's something you don't necessarily want to do, you can email a simple email to a legislator through our system. will be really important. Those are two incredibly important things, and that's going to start in January when the legislature meets, and it'll go till April. And that period of time will be it will be make or break. We get the relief. We need to get the relief then. If it doesn't, we are going to see businesses drop out, and we're already seeing people leave the arts sector. So the Illinois Creative Future Fund, meeting with legislators and emailing them is going to be very crucial as we gear up for January. And we can win it. And I'll give you one example of that. The city of Chicago, in its most recent budget, just included $26 million dedicated to COVID relief for the arts. 16 million of that is from the federal government money, but 10 million of that is the city's own money. So I think that's important. And I can send you those. I'll send, if is able to send the links out to other people. If I kind of send it to you, can we send? Okay. That's, I love those action questions, though. Thank you, Drew. And then I put some other considerations here, but the one that I just want to wrap up with, which I think in many ways is the most important kind of enduring understanding that I've come to, and that is just persistence, which is tough to do in a time of COVID. But there's a lot to be said with advocacy of just, I know it's cliche, but just showing up. A lot of these issues when it came to trying to influence the PPP loans or trying to win new loans from the state was a matter of just, in the Alliance, it's our job to locate these meetings where they're happening, is just showing up at the meetings. Oh, you guys are talking about relief? Well, hi, we're here, the arts, we're struggling, and to just be there. And then at the next meeting, be there again. And then at the next meeting, be there again. And there's a power in that persistent presence. That's an important thing with advocacy. And at the individual level, when you call your alder person, that's important. They get a second call from you. Okay, you don't want to bug them too much, but there is something to be said. And I was talking to David about this just before, but my own personal faith journey and faith community is from the Christian perspective, and the story that I've grown up with, that my parents would tell me because they were advocates in many ways, was the story, and I don't know if people have heard of the persistent widow. And it was a story that Jesus told as a parable. And it's actually a very short parable, but you can tell it's a pretty long story probably. And it's a widow who, and in Jesus' days, widows were part of society that was usually downtrodden, overlooked, and didn't have a voice. And she had an adversary, many translations call it, but she had been unfairly dealt with. And there was a judge who was basically deciding her case. And I'm paraphrasing here, it's in Luke 18. But she goes to him and she says, I need justice. And he's kind of like, the message kind of is, I don't care about justice. It's like, whatever. It's just like, get away from me. But she comes back again. And then she comes back again. And then she comes back again. And in the end, the judge basically says, again, to paraphrase it, I'll rule in your favor, just go. And it's interesting that Jesus, as he teaches his disciples, holds that up as something to strive for, of just being persistent. And I think that's what our call is to do. I think one way to be persistent, and this is going to bring us full circle, kind of back to doodling and art, one way to have the energy to be persistent is to practice creativity on a regular basis. This is definitely not in scripture or in any original manuscript, but I always imagine that widow as singing a lot. Like there was something that made her, like, she was a widow. I'm sure that she had a ton of burden on her in making ends meet, but she found the time and energy to be there in that judge's face all the time. And I'm sure a lot of it was driven by her own passion for her cause. But there's, again, no proof of this at all. But when I think about the story through my own lens, I go, I just picture her singing, that there was some creativity or something positive she had in her life that was able to keep her going. That's how I picture the story. And I think that that's what we need to do. And I want to encourage you to keep doodling, if you, and not just to listen to music, but to make music. Whether you are tapping, find something, quilting, or maybe you have it already, that you can do that's creative, where you're doing something creative, because it can give you energy and it can help you be persistent. COVID is about, there's a lot of COVID that's destruction and breaking down, and that wears our spirit down. But if as part of your day you have just a little bit of time where you're doing the opposite, you're creating, you're making, it can revive the soul and help you to be persistent. And you know what? You don't have to do it well. This, it's BS that you're either an artist or you're not. Blah, 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 blah. No, you're not born with an artist gene. Everybody can do it. Carol Bly, the author Carol Bly, kind of flips the common phrase on its head, and she says, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And there's some truth in that. So I can encourage you to keep doing whatever you do that's creative. For my kids, it's banjo. For my son, it's dancing has kept him moving every once in a while. And I'll just share, for me, what has started as doodles for me has helped me deal with COVID through what I would call anti-COVID beasts. So I started doodling at the beginning of COVID, and I would doodle little characters. And then a couple days, it was just so frustrating to see, COVID continue. And I began to imagine, what if there were species of animals and their only job was to destroy COVID? They were beasts and they were anti-COVID beasts. And so I began thinking of the four-legged anti-COVID virus stomper. And this would be a new animal that you see COVID down there in the bottom right. His job would be to step on COVID out of existence. Or what if you had the elephant-nosed COVID destroyer? And this would be an animal that would fry COVID out of existence. And I began to have creativity help me process COVID. What if there was an animal that would destroy COVID by zapping the virus out of existence, and it was called the COVID zapper? I would love an animal like that. Or if there was an animal that would shoot cannonballs at the COVID virus and knock the COVID virus out, maybe the cannon-nosed COVID destroyer. Or perhaps there would be the reverse rubbage anti-COVID beast, where it would treat COVID virus like a piece of garbage and pick it up and throw it away. So all of this creativity has helped me get through. And what I was able to do is, if someone donated to the arts, so you could donate to the Arts for Illinois Relief Fund, so your money would go towards helping artists who are out of work. If you would donate a certain amount, then I would name the animal after you. So you would have a species named after you. So a friend, Rekha Rajaris, there is now the Rakara rajanus beast. That's the scientific name. And so it was fun. It created community too. My sister, the Boltzma family, they now have a new species of animal named after them called the Boltzmasta boltvotura. So there's fun things that can be done with creativity, and it can kind of help you get through the day, whether you show it to others or not. So keep doing that art. If you want to contact me, you can contact me anytime. If you want to send me your doodle or not, or if you want to talk arts policy or not. Here's my contact information. And keep doodling and stay healthy in this time of COVID. And David, thank you for giving me, and Teresa, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be able to talk, probably for too long, but to be able to talk about and process with everyone what's happened and what questions we need to ask.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Yeah, and I just, before we run out of time, I want to open up and see if anybody does have any questions that they weren't able to ask throughout the talk that we can address now. Patrick, go ahead.
So Jonathan, thank you so much. My name is Patrick Green, and I'm really grateful that you took the time to present and share really the complexity of the issues that you presented. As you were talking and also sharing the various forms of advocacy, I often think in terms of how do we prepare our students as the young leaders that we will all be reporting to someday. How do we prepare them to be the advocates and the leaders? And immediately I wondered if you have an internship program for students, college students, or if not, if that is something that could be an asset to help build capacity of your organization.
Yeah, we have. I think the arts sector needs good policy and research people. And I'm not young anymore, so it's become more important to me to see how can we identify who those people are and encourage them to go into a field that I didn't know policy and advocacy was a field, let alone in the arts. I had no idea. I didn't know. I wound up here. But how can we help students explore this as a possibility? My concern is that the issues get polarized enough. We talked about the acronyms and how complex it gets, that it's easy to go, politics. I don't want to get into that. And that concerns me because destructive forces will get into it. How do we make sure that we have a future where there's people who care about the arts, who are willing to take on the acronyms and the discussions? And so I'm interested, the Alliance is very interested in how to identify those students, those people, and try to somehow give them experiences that are meaningful. We just had I just had two experiences. One where I had a student who wasn't really with any program, but she just contacted us out of the blue. Just completed some research into arts caucuses. That was really helpful. I've been an intern before and have done really meaningless work. So we try to give meaningful work. So we did have a student help research arts caucuses, legislative caucuses in other states. What would it mean like? We don't have one here. We just had a year-long fellow, Aisha, who was a graduate student who I mentioned research, and we had these research questions. We actually just gave one to her and connected with her to and she just took it to town. I mean, she just, I think, produced some stuff that's actually she'll be presenting at conferences probably pretty soon in terms of mapping the assets of. So the answer is yes. I think for us, honestly, it's mostly, we're a 5-person. It's one of those things where we're a 5-person organization, so we really want the help, but then we don't necessarily have the capacity to also, make it meaningful. We're also, the other thing I would say that we usually look for is resources. Artists are very used to being asked to do stuff without being paid. You rarely ask an accountant to do your taxes for free, but somehow when it comes to graphic design, like every artist is a volunteer, right? So, and from an equity point too, we don't like to bring on interns if they're not paid, or if they're not somehow getting some type of benefit. So that is something that we look for when we take on an intern or a student is how can we recognize them as a part of the team with having resources or compensation or something.
Great. Next, Christian, I think you have your hand up, and then Carol, you can go after Christian.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Jonathan. Thank
Morning.
you for the presentation. It was very illustrative, and I think we all had the opportunity to learn more about how the creative sector is making efforts in obtaining funding. And that's one of the issues that I would like to learn more is how is this funding or how is this funding going to support the creative sector after COVID, knowing that we still are facing COVID restrictions?
Mhm.
Are there any particular projects that are going to come out that already deal with the restrictions created by COVID? And are there also any priorities within the creative sector? Because even when we I believe that there are certain projects that could be more attractive to get a bigger audience. So that's my question.
You mean certain say a little bit more about that? There's certain projects that are more attractive in terms of for artists to do, or say a little bit more about that.
No, more about I am also thinking of what type of audience these projects will have. And especially unfortunately, when we are thinking of money, especially when it's scarce, I was thinking what type of projects get prioritized, and especially because I see in that intersection the opportunity to deal with issues like you were mentioning on racial discrimination, for instance, and how this also could open opportunities for updating and doing things differently among within the creative sector. I'm making offers.
Yeah. I think you hit on something really, really important that sometimes keeps me up at night, and that is that our elected leaders want COVID to be done, and they want us to just keep moving. But then our sector is going to take longer. So it's not matching. We have public officials that are going, okay, we're done. We're all better now, right? Like they see some arts venues opening, they see restaurants opening and stuff like that, and they go, we're done. But we have a longer road. So how do we bridge that gap where we're trying to convince them that no, we still are hurting, and that support for us needs to lengthen out. And what we've found is most helpful to make that happen is to center legislators on an ask, a very specific, concrete ask. And for us, we're channeling, I think, what you're kind of talking about into what we call that Illinois Creative Future Fund, where we're saying you have over $5 billion. And right now, before you get too far ahead of yourself of everything's okay, in this next session, we want you to dedicate 500 million of that to the arts. We've saved very clearly in the proposal and have wording for it that money needs to prioritize BIPOC communities and other communities disproportionately impacted by COVID, including rural communities. That has to govern. And so when we look at the 500 million, and I can send you a sheet, we talk about 75 million of that going to arts education, knowing that students desperately need the arts right now. It's helping them with the socio-emotional learning to deal with the trauma. 75 million would go to capital grants. We're seeing theaters that are saying we need to rearrange how our lobby is so that when the next pandemic happens, we can deal with it that way. So that would be 75 million. And then we have workforce development would be 75 million. And then we have 100 million for relief for independent venues, performing arts organizations, and then kind of from there. So to answer your question, we're trying to focus everything on that in January, to say that money, we need it now, and it has to be dedicated to us through the next 3 years. If we want to win that, we want to get that And then our next stage, if we can get that, is then to begin to influence what projects that goes to, so that I can go to the types of projects that you're referring to.
Mhm.
I don't know. Does that help? Is that
Yeah,
helpful?
actually,
We're
yeah.
calling the question. We're like, you have this money, we need it, and it needs to be done with equity. So let's do it.
Thank you very much.
And Carol, you had a question? Oh, you're still muted, Carol.
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to unmute myself. This is more a comment than a question, and I don't expect it. There's really an answer. But I'm Carol Scheidenhelm. I'm retired from Loyola. My husband's a retired art educator, been involved in the arts for decades. My PhD's in English, so the humanities are really taking a hit right now. I think what underlies all the threats to the arts is that there is an increasing movement to devalue it at every level, to cut out art programs, to cut out music programs. Even when my husband was teaching, he had to fight for funding for his high school art programs. And of course, that meant that he gave up a lot of his time, and we paid for a lot of materials so that we could keep things going. So I think it needs to be said that underlying all these issues that we have right now with funding of the arts at a higher level is that devaluing of the arts, even back in the elementary and high school programs.
Yeah. Do you have another hour, Carol? Because let's talk about that. Because you're exactly right. I think what I mentioned is the arts are one of the few subjects in Illinois that's not mandated. You can go through high school and never take the arts. Yeah, that is a deep-seated problem.
It's not on the test. Arts are not on the test. Yeah, the standardized, it's not being tested. And, that's another issue.
There's a real, it's a little bit past time, but if you, I don't know if you Google if it would come up, but if you Google Illinois, I don't have the, I'll try to get the link. We did a campaign that was 4 years, and it's really wonkish, but it's really fun too. What it does is, just to be real brief, it's called the ESSA Arts Indicator. Every state a couple years ago had to totally revamp its accountability system. The system, a new law was passed that replaced No Child Left Behind, and it said to states, you have to develop a whole new system for how you grade schools. Well, you can guess what Illinois and other states put in: science tests, you name it, math proficiency, English language proficiency. But there's an interesting thing that they did for the first time. The federal government said, you know what? When you make your accountability system, you have to include at least one thing that's not a test. It can be something that gets at school quality. Could be absenteeism, could be school climate. And we in Illinois said, aha, what if that thing was whether or not students in that school got the arts? So every school in this new system has a score out of 100 points. And we began to say, whoa, wait a second. What if a school gained or lost points based on the amount of arts it gives? And we were able to win that over 4 years. So the Illinois is the only state in the nation that, as part of its accountability system now, has what we call a distinct arts indicator. And what that means is your points will go up or down on whether you provide the arts, high points. That's still in the process of being developed, but that was one wonkish way we're trying to get at. But I think, Carol, the point you bring up is a huge underlying cultural point that you, I'm sure, have worked your career and still working on that we need to work on too.
Jonathan, thank you so much. We are, like you said, at time, but anyone that wants to reach out, you saw his contact information. You can also email me if you have any questions about how to get in touch. And again, thank you so much for being here. This has been super helpful. And I'm going to give myself special permission to doodle more often. So thank you for that.
I did too, just put the link to our action center. So if you want to keep up to date on emails you can send or whatever, there's the link.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and for everybody who could join us today, and go out and make some art, do some art
Yeah.
today. So
Great. Thank you, everyone.